The blizzard showed no mercy as Serena collapsed into the snow, her body too weak to take another step. The world around her was a blur of white, the wind howling like a creature that could taste her desperation. Her limbs felt heavy, her heart slower with each breath. It had been hours, maybe days. How long had she been walking through this storm? There was no way to tell. She was alone now, cast out, left to die. The town had made its decision, and she was the unwanted one. Her eyes, once full of life, had begun to dull with exhaustion and hopelessness. In the distance, the shadow of the town's gates loomed like a memory she couldn't escape. They had shut her out, as if she was just another discarded piece of trash. The snow stung her face as she tried to rise, but her body betrayed her, forcing her to her knees. "Let the winter take her," they'd said. One less mouth to feed. The words still echoed in her mind, cruel and cold, like the storm that battered her. They'd done it in front of everyone, an official town meeting where they decided she was expendable. Serena had been orphaned as a child, left to wander from one cold town to the next, never staying anywhere long enough to be truly seen or wanted. Her life had been a series of empty faces and cold shoulders, until now. Serena's hands, numb and stiff, clutched the faded ribbon that had once been a gift from her mother, a last reminder of the love she had lost. It was all she had left. The tiny piece of cloth felt like the only connection to something real in a world that had turned its back on her. As her body trembled from the cold, memories of her mother rushed through her mind. The warmth of her embrace, the stories she used to tell, the gentle lullaby that soothed her to sleep. But all that was gone now. She was alone in the snow, abandoned and soon to be forgotten. She had no hope left, only the cold. And as the snow began to blur her vision and her strength faded, she welcomed the numbness that seemed to sweep over her. Perhaps death would be a kind relief, a final escape from a world that had never cared. But just as her consciousness began to slip away, she heard something, a sound through the howling wind, faint at first, then louder. The crunch of boots moving through the snow. Someone was coming. Was it a stranger? Or was it another cruel soul coming to finish what the town had started? Serena couldn't tell, her thoughts slipping away into darkness. The sound grew closer, and she felt a tug of confusion, the last of her awareness barely holding onto reality. Then, a voice broke through the storm, a deep, steady voice that seemed to wrap itself around her like a blanket, warm and solid. "I've got you," it said, the words cutting through the howling wind. "Don't you dare give up now." Her body stiffened instinctively, a mix of fear and relief flooding through her. Was this real? Was this man truly here to help? Or was he yet another threat, disguised as salvation? She couldn't answer. Her vision had already faded, and all she could do was trust that the hands lifting her from the snow were not the hands of another cruel fate. As she was lifted, she felt the softness of thick furs against her skin, the warmth of a fire crackling nearby. But everything around her felt distant, as if she were still floating between life and death. The voice from earlier, so comforting, so strong, spoke again, though this time she couldn't make out the words. Still, the tenderness in the tone made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, Serena allowed herself to breathe without fear of rejection, without the weight of the town's judgment on her. She had been abandoned in the harshest way possible, left to freeze in the winter's cold, but now she wasn't alone. And in that moment, just before sleep took her completely, she felt something stir inside her, a faint spark of hope. But hope, like everything else in her life, felt fragile. Could she trust this stranger? Was it even possible to trust anyone ever again? And if this man truly meant her no harm, why would he stop for someone like her? She didn't have answers. Not yet. But for the first time, as her eyes closed and her body finally gave into the warmth surrounding her, Serena allowed herself to believe, even if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she had been found for a reason. "Who are you?" she whispered into the darkness, though she wasn't sure if anyone heard her. There was no reply, only the sound of steady, comforting breaths, a silence that spoke louder than any answer ever could. The world outside may have been cold and unforgiving, but in that moment, she was safe. For now. Strong arms lifted her from the snow, and a deep voice cut through the wind. "I've got you. Don't you dare give up now." Serena woke to warmth for the first time in days, but fear gripped her chest. Whose cabin was this? What would he demand in return? The fire crackled in the hearth, sending waves of heat that contrasted sharply with the icy numbness that had claimed her body just hours ago. She lay beneath thick furs, her hands wrapped in bandages, but the movement of the stranger who had saved her, his large form tending to the fire, kept her on edge. She was not used to kindness, nor to being cared for without an ulterior motive. Every gesture of warmth, every caring touch, felt like a trap, an offering with a hidden cost. She watched him silently, trying to gather her thoughts, but exhaustion kept clouding her mind. Her body was sore, bruised from the cold and from the storm, but she was alive. That alone felt like a miracle. But the reality of her situation soon pressed in on her again. What would this man want from her? He had no reason to help her, no reason to keep her alive, other than to use her in some way. Men never did anything without expecting something in return. But Silas, the lumberjack who had found her, didn't seem the type to be manipulative. He was quiet, gruff even, but there was a calmness in his eyes that spoke of a life lived in solitude. The cabin around her was simple, yet well kept, hand-hewn logs, a single bed by the fire, and tools lined neatly along the walls. This was a man who knew how to survive on his own in the wilderness. As she lay there, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for being so dependent. How had she gotten so weak? It wasn't in her nature to rely on anyone, not after everything she'd been through. Her mind was racing with thoughts of leaving, of getting up and running before she became too comfortable, before he would expect something of her. But she couldn't. The fire was too warm, the pain too sharp. She couldn't move. "You're awake." Silas's deep voice broke through her thoughts, sending a jolt through her. He was standing by the fire, his back to her, but she could see the way his broad shoulders moved with purpose, his movements steady and deliberate. He wasn't afraid of her. "How do you feel?" he asked, though his voice wasn't filled with pity. He was simply asking, as if he expected no more than an honest answer. "I'm fine," she croaked, the words sounding foreign in her throat. He turned around slowly, his gaze soft but steady, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, his large hands reaching for hers with a gentleness that confused her. Her body stiffened instinctively, pulling back just a fraction, but his calmness never wavered. "You're lucky to be alive," he muttered, his voice like gravel. "Found you half frozen out there. You weren't moving, no tracks left. I almost didn't see you. Why did you help me?" Serena asked, her voice hoarse and tinged with suspicion. It was hard for her to trust anyone, especially men who came out of nowhere offering kindness. She had seen what that led to before. "Because you were still breathing," Silas replied simply, his gaze intense yet unreadable. He wasn't lying, but she felt that there was more to his reason than just that. His actions seemed too purposeful, too deliberate for it to be so simple. "Most people would have left you there," he continued, as if reading her mind. "But I've got no one else around here, and I'm not one to leave someone in the cold." The words seemed honest enough, yet they didn't ease her doubt. Serena couldn't afford to trust anyone, not in this world, not after all she'd been through. "You live alone?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Silas paused for a moment, his eyes scanning her face as if considering how much to share. Finally, he nodded. "I do. Lived out here for years now. Learned to take care of myself. But I don't mind company. Not often, but I don't mind." The honesty in his voice, made her wonder. He wasn't lying, but there was still something about him, something raw and unspoken that made her cautious. A part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him and let the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the cabin wash away the years of rejection and loneliness that had plagued her. But another part of her, the part that had learned to survive, warned her to be careful. She couldn't afford to let her guard down too soon. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. Silas didn't flinch at the question. Instead, he simply looked at her, his face softening ever so slightly. "Nothing," he said, his voice quiet. "I found you. That's all." She didn't believe him. People didn't do things without a reason, and while she wasn't sure what his reason was, Serena knew better than to trust without proof. But as the hours passed, the warmth of the fire, the simple gestures of kindness, began to crack the wall she had built around herself. Silas didn't expect anything from her. He simply wanted her to heal, to rest. He didn't touch her, didn't ask anything of her beyond her company. When night fell, he showed her to a loft room above the main floor. It was modest but warm, and for the first time in ages, Serena felt something close to safety. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, hearing Silas's quiet movements downstairs as he settled in for the night. He didn't try to come to her, didn't try to make her feel grateful. She could hear him breathing steadily below, just beyond the floorboards, and though the silence felt strange to her, it was also peaceful. As the hours passed and the storm outside raged on, Serena realized something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge for years. She wasn't alone anymore. But whether she could trust that feeling, whether it was just a fleeting illusion, remained to be seen. And as sleep slowly claimed her, a part of her couldn't help but wonder what would come next, what this strange, quiet man would ask of her, and what, if anything, she could give in return. Days turned to weeks, and with each passing moment, the blizzards outside grew harsher. But inside the cabin, something unexpected was taking root, a slow, steady rhythm of life that neither Serena nor Silas had anticipated. The world outside seemed frozen in time, the heavy snowdrifts piling higher against the door, but within the warmth of the cabin, something like comfort began to settle between them. Serena's strength returned gradually, but it was her spirit that had been most broken, the weight of rejection and isolation pressing on her with every passing day. Still, Silas never rushed her, never asked for more than she could give, and in return, she began to trust him. Not fully, not yet, but enough to allow herself to exist beside him without constant fear. She found herself helping with the small tasks of the cabin, cooking meals, mending clothes, even tending to the fire. She insisted on doing more than just surviving. She needed to feel like she had purpose, something to contribute in this unexpected place. Silas was patient with her, showing her how to gather firewood, how to patch up the walls of the cabin where the cold crept through, how to set snares for rabbits in the snow. They shared meals together in silence. The food often simple, steamed vegetables, freshly caught meat. But the act of eating together felt like a quiet victory over the cold world outside. There was something peaceful in their routine, a kind of companionship neither had ever expected. The evenings were quiet, too. Silas would sit by the fire, carving small figures from wood, while Serena worked on mending the worn clothes he had collected over the years. Sometimes, when the silence stretched long, she would hum a tune she remembered from childhood, a soft, gentle melody that she hadn't sung in years. At first, Silas seemed oblivious to the sound, but soon he would pause in his carving, his eyes lost in thought as the music filled the room. Then one evening, she laughed, really laughed for the first time in years. It was at Silas, of course. He had tried, awkwardly, to mimic the way she had hummed, but he couldn't quite get the rhythm right, and the sound he made was so comically off-key that it had her chuckling despite herself. The noise was pure and unguarded, and it startled both of them. Silas stared at her for a moment, his rough exterior softening for the briefest of seconds before he shrugged and muttered, "I don't get it. Can't carry a tune, I guess." Serena smiled, shaking her head. "No, you can't." And it felt good to be able to joke, to see the absurdity of the moment without the weight of shame that had followed her for so long. Over time, the distance between them shrank. Silas would drape an extra fur over her shoulders when the cold air of the night crept in, his rough hands brushing against her skin in the process. She used to tense up at even the smallest touch, but now she found herself relaxing, savoring the warmth that didn't feel like it came with strings attached. There were other moments, too, quiet moments where they found themselves simply existing in the same space. One afternoon, when she was stirring a pot of stew, Silas had come up behind her, leaning in the doorway, watching her as she worked. She felt his gaze, but didn't turn to meet it, instead focusing on the simple task in front of her. When she finally did glance up, his expression was softer than usual, the tension in his jaw loosening for a moment. Serena's heart gave a strange little flutter, but she quickly turned her attention back to the stew, unwilling to acknowledge the shift between them. Yet, it was hard to ignore how much had changed. She found herself looking for his presence, waiting for him to come home at the end of the day, for the sound of his footsteps outside the cabin. The rhythm of her days had become entwined with his in a way she hadn't expected, and in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. The winter outside was harsh, relentless, but in the warmth of the cabin, it felt as if they had created something new, something separate from the cold world that had tried to swallow them both. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas spoke for the first time about his past. It was casual, almost dismissive, but it caught Serena off guard. "I wasn't always out here," he said, his voice low. "Had a wife once and a son. Lost them both to fever a few winters back. After that, I figured it was better to be alone. The world doesn't care much for a man who's lost everything." Serena's heart ached for him, though she didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," she finally managed, her voice soft. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." Silas didn't reply right away. Instead, he reached for the fire poker, stirring the embers thoughtfully. "It's the kind of thing that changes you. I don't much care for people anymore, not since that. But out here, well, I figured I could forget a little bit of it. Just me and the trees. The snow. No one to disappoint. No one to disappoint me." He glanced up at her, his face harder now, the emotion fleeting as quickly as it had come. Serena understood, more than he realized. "I know," she whispered. "I've never really had anyone either. Just kept moving, trying to outrun it all." The words hung between them, not needing any further explanation. They both understood loss in a way that no one else ever could. That was why they were here now, two people in the middle of nowhere, learning how to survive in a world that had left them both behind. And still, Serena couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the snow began to melt, when the harsh winter gave way to spring. Would their fragile peace be enough to hold them together, or would the world outside come crashing back in? There were days when Serena felt like she was starting to trust Silas, to let down the wall she had built to protect herself from pain. But other days, the fear would creep back in. The fear of being abandoned again. The fear of being alone once more. That fear, more than anything, made her wary of letting herself hope. Still, as the days stretched on, she found herself waking in the mornings with less dread, with the smallest spark of something like warmth in her heart. Perhaps it was the fire, or perhaps it was Silas himself. Whatever it was something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. The winter was far from over, but perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally found a place where she could rest. The thought was both terrifying and beautiful. The days grew longer, the snow beginning to melt as the harshest part of winter passed. The air felt fresher, though still sharp with the last remnants of cold. Inside the cabin, things had become routine, but there was an unease that hung over Serena, an unease she couldn't shake. Each day, as she worked alongside Silas, cooking meals, mending clothes, learning how to chop wood with a skill that still eluded her. A part of her felt herself growing closer to him, closer than she ever intended. It wasn't just the comfort of his presence that she feared. It was the way he made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a burden to him. She was someone who mattered enough for him to care for her without asking for anything in return. And that terrified her. It terrified her because she had never known a life where kindness didn't come with strings attached. The harshness of her past, the endless rejection, the sharp words of the townspeople who had thrown her away like a piece of garbage, had shaped her into someone who didn't trust easily, who always expected the worst. Silas was the first person who hadn't treated her like she was worthless. But how long could that last? How long before he, too, would see her as the burden she feared she was? One morning, as she gathered her few belongings, her heart weighed heavy with a decision she knew she had to make. She had stayed for as long as she could bear, but now, the whispers in her mind, the same voices that had plagued her for years, demanded that she leave. If she stayed, if she allowed herself to grow too comfortable here, it would only lead to pain. Silas didn't deserve to be tied to her, to the whispers and the judgment that would surely follow once people began to notice her presence. He had already risked his reputation by helping her, but how long would that last? Soon, his solitude would be broken, and the world outside would crawl back into their lives, bringing with it the weight of their judgments. Silas deserved better than her, better than the trouble and shame she brought with her. He didn't need to be weighed down by a woman who had nothing left to give, nothing but the faded ribbon of her past and a broken spirit. With the faint light of dawn creeping through the window, Serena packed a small bundle of her things, her hands shaking as she folded her mended clothes and the few small items she had managed to gather over the weeks. Things that no longer mattered, not when she was leaving. The ribbon she had kept so close to her chest for so many years now seemed like a useless reminder of everything she had lost. She would leave it behind, too. As she slipped the bundle over her shoulder, she hesitated at the door, looking back at the cabin one last time. Silas had been kind to her, more than she could ever have expected, but that kindness would only hurt him in the end. He would be better off without her. She couldn't let herself be the reason his peace was shattered. Just as she was about to step out, the sound of footsteps from downstairs froze her in place. The door creaked open, and Silas's shadow appeared in the doorway, his gaze piercing and steady, as if he had known what she was planning. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep, but clear and firm, just like him. Serena's heart slammed against her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsing in her mind as if it would somehow make the pain easier, but it was never easier. Somewhere else, she finally managed, her voice trembling. "Somewhere far from here. I don't want to be a burden anymore." Silas didn't move, his gaze never leaving hers. "What trouble are you talking about?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost too soft, as if the weight of her words hurt him. "The trouble of being here with me," she whispered, her throat tight. "You've been kind, but I can't stay. I won't ruin your life just because I don't know how to leave. I can't be the reason your world gets turned upside down. You deserve better than this." Silas took a step closer, his face hard with something like anger. Anger not at her, but at the situation, at the unfairness of it all. "You think I'd rather be alone?" he asked, his voice rough. "You think I'm better off with no one, just the cold and the trees?" Serena opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a hand, cutting her off. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I stopped caring about the town's opinion long ago." The words hit her harder than she expected. The last time anyone had said something like that to her, it had been an empty promise, a lie veiled in kindness. But Silas wasn't lying. He meant it, every word, and for the first time, she realized that she didn't have to leave to protect him. He wasn't asking for her to leave. He wasn't pushing her away. He was asking her to stay. Her chest tightened as tears threatened to spill, but she fought them back. "But I care," she said, her voice breaking. "I care about what they think. I don't want to ruin everything you've worked for. You've been nothing but kind to me, Silas. You saved my life, but I know." He cut in, his voice softer now. "You're not ruining anything. You're part of this now. I'm asking you to stay because I want you here. And I'm not asking for anything more than that. I want to be here with you, together." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Serena stood frozen, her body trembling, unsure of what to do. She had spent so many years convincing herself that she was nothing, that she was unworthy of love or kindness. But Silas was offering her something she had never allowed herself to imagine, an invitation to stay, to be part of something real, something that could last. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she lowered her bundle, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of something more than survival. "I don't know how to stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then we'll learn together," Silas replied, taking a step closer, his hand reaching for hers. The warmth of his touch sent a shock through her, and for the first time, it felt like hope, a hope she hadn't known in so long. With a soft nod, Serena let herself believe, just for a moment, that she could stay. That maybe for once it would be enough. The days grew longer as the thawing snow signaled the slow arrival of spring, a season that promised renewal but also brought with it the stirrings of something unsettling. Inside the cabin, Serena and Silas had settled into a quiet rhythm. The cold winds of winter no longer howled through the cracks in the walls, and the warmth of the hearth felt more like a familiar companion than a necessity. Serena had begun to take on more responsibilities around the cabin, learning how to keep a garden, small at first, but growing steadily with each passing day. She tended to the plot of earth near the cabin, planting herbs, beans, and carrots, each seed a quiet promise that her life could be more than mere survival. Silas, too, seemed to be thriving in this newfound peace. His hands were busy building a small fence around the garden and repairing the cabin's roof. Each task was done with a quiet confidence that came from years of solitude. Yet there was something different now. Serena could see it in the way he looked at her when she laughed or when they worked side by side. He wasn't just surviving anymore either. He was living. They spent more time together, sharing stories from the past, stories that revealed the wounds they both carried. Silas had begun to talk more about his late wife and child, the grief still raw in his voice when he spoke of them. But there was no longer a wall between them, no longer a silence that separated them from each other. The simple, shared work of each day, cooking, cleaning, mending, had become a conversation of its own, a slow, steady building of trust and affection that neither had expected. And yet, just as the promise of spring seemed to settle in, a shadow loomed over their peace, a threat they could not ignore. It started with a knock at the door, a rare occurrence in a remote cabin. Serena had been in the garden, her hands covered in dirt as she worked with the young plants, when she heard Silas's voice, low and tense, as he spoke to someone at the door. By the time she reached the cabin, she saw a man standing in front of Silas, tall, well-dressed, with a sharp, calculating look in his eyes. Serena's heart sank as she recognized him. It was Mr. Hewitt, the same man who had been part of the town that had cast her out, the man who had made it clear that she was nothing more than a burden, a piece of property that could be discarded when it was no longer useful. "Serena Brennan," he said when he saw her approach, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Didn't expect to find you alive, girl." The words stung, and Serena's instincts flared, a deep sense of danger crawling up her spine. She forced herself to stand tall, even as her heart hammered in her chest. "What do you want, Hewitt?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but it trembled despite her efforts. Hewitt's smile was cold and calculating. "Oh, nothing much. Just came to check in on you. Seems your guardian, what was her name? The church matron, passed last fall." leaving behind quite a bit of debt. Funny how that works, isn't it? Orphans always owe something. Serena's stomach turned. She had no idea what he was talking about. The matron had never spoken of debts, never mentioned anything about her being responsible for anything. I don't owe you anything, Serena said firmly, though her voice quivered. I don't owe anyone. Hewitt's smile widened. That's where you're wrong. The debts of the dead don't just disappear. You either come back and work in the town laundries until they're paid off, or we find another way to settle the score. And trust me, there are men who'd pay for a girl like you. Silas stepped forward then, his presence imposing, and Serena could feel his protective instinct rising. She's not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and calm, but there was an unmistakable firmness to it. Hewitt didn't back down. He looked Silas up and down, sizing him up with the kind of contempt that only someone like Hewitt could manage. And who are you? Her keeper? Her protector, he sneered. Silas's gaze never faltered. I'm the one telling you to leave. Now, but Hewitt wasn't easily deterred. He allowed a harsh laugh. You think this is over? Think a man can't claim what's his? You're a fool, Thorne. She's nothing but trouble. She always will be. The venom in his words hit Serena harder than she expected. She had been called many things in her life, but hearing them from Hewitt in front of Silas felt like a slap to the face. You don't know her, Silas said, his jaw tightening. You don't know anything about her. But Hewitt was already turning to leave, still spitting insults over his shoulder as he mounted his horse. I'll be back, he called. And when I do, you'll regret this. Mark my words, Thorne. The door slammed shut behind him, and the room was filled with an uneasy silence. Serena stood frozen, her mind racing. He's going to come back, she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. He's going to bring men. They'll take me. Silas's gaze softened, and he walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. No, he said quietly. You don't have to run anymore. We'll face this. But the fear inside her was hard to suppress. She had seen how men like Hewitt operated. They didn't care about the law or right and wrong. They took what they wanted, and when they were done, they tossed you aside like you never mattered. I can't just stay here, she said, her voice breaking. I can't let him take me. I won't be his slave. Silas's eyes darkened with resolve. Then we'll find another way. We won't let him take you. I promise. That night, Silas rode out alone, leaving Serena to worry about what might happen when he returned. The thought of him going to town, facing the law, was terrifying. What if the law didn't protect her? What if Hewitt had already found a way to twist the truth to make her the villain in his story? As she lay awake in the silence of the cabin, the weight of everything, her past, the fear of being taken away again, the uncertainty of Silas's plan, settled over her like a heavy blanket. There was no turning back now. What if they couldn't win? What if Hewitt was right? And yet, there was still that small flicker of hope. Hope that Silas would find a way to protect her, to make sure she wouldn't have to face this alone. The sun had barely risen when Serena and Silas stood in front of the judge, their hands clasped together, eyes locked with a shared sense of determination. They had married that morning, in the simplest way possible, just the judge as witness, the cold morning air surrounding them like a reminder that even the hardest battles could be fought in the quietest of moments. Silas, in a clean shirt he had carefully chosen for the occasion, stood taller than ever, his face set in that familiar expression of quiet resolve. Serena, wearing her mended dress with a few wildflowers tucked in her hair, tried to hold back the tears, but she couldn't. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but something else, something unfamiliar, something that had been buried deep within her for years, a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. She had thought it was lost to her forever, that the cruel world she had grown up in would never allow it to bloom. But standing here beside Silas, in front of the judge who had quietly supported their decision, something inside her was shifting, opening like the first buds of spring. Their vows were simple, honest. No grand speeches, No promises that could never be kept. But in the weight of their words, they meant more than anything that had ever been said to her before. "I choose you," Silas had said, his voice steady, but with an undeniable tenderness that made Serena's heart flutter. "I choose you too," she had whispered back, her voice breaking in the way only true vulnerability could. And that was all. Nothing more needed to be said. The rest of the world could have faded away, and Serena would have been content in that moment, knowing that she was not alone, that for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her. After the ceremony, they went to a small inn for a quiet breakfast, the judge treating them to a meal that was simple, yet warm. But even in that brief moment of peace, Serena could feel the weight of the town's judgment already starting to press in on them. Word would spread quickly. After all, the town wasn't exactly known for its generosity of spirit, and Serena's past was a wound that had never truly healed. She had seen the way people looked at her when she first arrived in town all those months ago. She had felt the whispers behind her back, the stares of suspicion. And now, with her marriage to Silas, she could already imagine the rumors that would spread like wildfire. They would say it was out of pity, or that she had trapped Silas into marrying her for some reason. Some might even say she had stolen him from his wife's memory, though Silas had made it clear time and time again that he had chosen to live alone after losing his family. And yet, those who didn't know would find their own ways to judge. But nothing in the world could prepare them for what came next. By mid-afternoon, as Silas and Serena walked to the general store to buy a few things for the cabin, they were met by the harsh figure of Hewitt. His face was twisted in that same smug expression, the one that had made Serena's blood run cold the moment she first saw him. But this time, his smile was different. It was dark, full of a cruel amusement that sent a shiver down her spine. "So, the lumberjack's new wife," he sneered. "You really thought a piece of paper could save you? You think this marriage will protect you from what's coming?" Silas's jaw clenched, but he stood firm, his arm instinctively moving to protect Serena. "She's my wife," Silas said, his voice low and steady, but filled with a deadly calm. "And this is over. Leave her alone, Hewitt. I won't warn you again." But Hewitt wasn't done. His voice grew louder, filled with venom. "You think you've won, don't you? Everyone's going to see this for what it really is. A man like you, taking in a worthless orphan, marrying her like she's worth something. You've made a fool of yourself, Thorne. And you, girl," he turned to Serena, his gaze full of disdain, "you've ruined your last chance. This is the end of the line for you. You'll never belong here, not with anyone. Not with him." Serena's stomach twisted, but she stood tall, refusing to let his words break her, refusing to let him see how much his hate still affected her. She had heard it all before, and for once, she wasn't afraid. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice steady, her heart racing, but firm in a way that surprised even her. "You don't know what I've been through, what I've survived. I'm not the girl you thought you could break. And I'm not going anywhere." Silas stood beside her, his protective presence like a shield, and for the first time in a long time, Serena felt something inside her click into place, a sense of power she had never allowed herself to embrace. She wasn't the broken girl anymore. She wasn't the girl who had been cast aside by a town that never cared. She was someone else now, someone stronger. "She's right," Silas said, his voice filled with quiet strength. "She's my wife, and you're going to leave her alone." Now, the crowd of people who had gathered around them murmured, and for a brief moment, Serena saw doubt in Hewitt's eyes, something flickering beneath his usual arrogance. But it was gone quickly, replaced by a sneer that only confirmed that he wasn't finished. "I'll be back," he spat, before turning and walking away, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his threat. The crowd dispersed slowly, the air thick with tension. Serena stood there, her heart still pounding, but now she felt something different, something fierce, something that wouldn't let her back down. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from her past, from the shame or the judgment. She was standing her ground. And as she walked back to the cabin with Silas, his hand resting gently on her back, she knew she had made the right choice. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The promise of a future she could now claim for herself. It had been months since that bitter confrontation in town, months since the weight of Hewitt's threats had hovered over them like a storm cloud waiting to break. But spring had come, bringing with it the warmth of new life, the green shoots of hope that grew stronger with each passing day. The cabin that had once been a place of survival had become a home, a sanctuary filled with love and laughter. Serena had planted a garden that flourished in the soft earth, the beans, carrots, and herbs growing tall and strong, symbols of the new life she had begun to build. Every morning, she woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the windows, the sound of birds calling in the trees outside. The days were filled with work and contentment, with Silas by her side, his presence a steady reassurance that everything they had fought for was worth it. They spent hours in the garden, tending to the plants together, their hands brushing as they worked side by side. It felt right, this quiet life, this new rhythm that had been born from their shared strength. There were moments of peace, moments when Serena would catch Silas's eye, and for a brief second, the world around them would fade away. Their love had grown slowly, like the garden they tended, but it had become something beautiful, something neither of them had expected. Silas was no longer just the man who had rescued her from the snow. He was her partner, her equal. And she was no longer the lost, broken girl who had been thrown away by the world. She had learned to stand tall beside him, to believe in the life they were creating together. It was during this time, as the cabin filled with the scent of fresh herbs and the soft warmth of the sun, that Serena discovered she was pregnant. She had been late, her cycle disrupted by the changes in her body, the stress of everything she had been through. At first, she had dismissed it, but as the days passed and the nausea crept in, there was no denying it. She was going to have a child. The realization hit her with a mixture of joy and fear. A child. She could hardly believe it. For so long, she had felt like an orphan, like someone who had no place in the world, no legacy to leave behind. But now, she had a chance to build something for herself, for Silas, and for this child who had yet to even take its first breath. She had never imagined that motherhood would be part of her story, but here it was, woven into the fabric of her new life. She told Silas one afternoon as they sat by the fire, the quiet crackle of the flames filling the room. He had been carving a small figure of a bear, his hands steady and focused, when she spoke the words that changed everything. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, I think I'm pregnant." For a moment, he didn't respond. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if he needed to be sure that she was serious. Then, slowly, his face broke into a smile, an expression of pure joy and disbelief. "A child," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to have a child, Serena." And in that moment, Serena's heart swelled with a joy she had never thought possible. This was the life she had always dreamed of, one filled with love, with hope, and with the promise of a future. Silas's joy was contagious, and the two of them spent the evening talking about their plans for the future, about the nursery they would build, about the kind of life they wanted to give their child. The cabin, which had once felt like a place of isolation, now felt like a home, full of love and laughter and the promise of something new. But just as spring was beginning to settle in, a shadow from the past returned. It started with a knock at the door, and Serena's stomach dropped when she saw the figure standing outside. It was Hewitt again, and this time, he wasn't alone. Two rough-looking men stood behind him, their faces hard, their eyes cold. "You didn't think it was over, did you?" Hewitt sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You thought you could hide away here with the Lumberjack and forget all about the debts you owe. Well, I'm here to collect, and I'm not leaving without what's mine." Serena's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at Silas. But he remained calm, his expression unreadable. He stepped in front of her, his presence a wall between her and the threat outside. "You're not taking her anywhere," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no claim here, no right to her or to me." Hewitt's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his men following his lead. "I don't care what you think," he growled. "She's still bound by the debts of the dead, and I'll make sure that she pays for them one way or another." The men behind Hewitt stepped forward as if to back up his threat, but Silas didn't flinch. "You're wrong," he said, his voice colder than the winter air. "She owes you nothing, and if you think you can intimidate her, you're going to have to get through me first." The tension in the air was thick, the sound of their breathing the only noise in the stillness. But before Hewitt could escalate the situation further, a sound broke through the silence, the sound of hooves approaching. A moment later, the judge from the town, along with the local sheriff, appeared in the clearing outside the cabin. Silas had sent word ahead, knowing that this moment would come, knowing that Hewitt would try to intimidate them again. The judge, a tall man with a stern expression, dismounted from his horse and walked toward the group, his eyes fixed firmly on Hewitt. "Hewitt," the judge said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the tension in the air. "You're under arrest for fraud, for extortion, and for harassing these people. You've been warned before, but now it's over." Hewitt's face turned pale as the sheriff stepped forward, the law on their side. "What are you going to do, huh?" Hewitt spat, but his defiance was hollow. "You're making a mistake. This isn't over." But the sheriff moved quickly, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him away. "It is now," the sheriff said, his voice firm. And just like that, the threat was over. Hewitt and his men were led away, their threats fading into the distance as they were taken into custody. Serena stood in silence, her heart still racing. But this time it wasn't from fear, it was from relief. It was really over. She was free. The judge turned to Silas and Serena, nodding as he spoke. "You won't have to worry about him anymore. He'll be locked up for good this time. No more threats, no more fear." Serena could hardly believe it. After all this time, after everything she had been through, it was finally over. She was safe. She and Silas were safe. The future they had dreamed of was within their reach. As the judge and sheriff rode off, leaving the two of them alone again, Serena collapsed into Silas's arms, the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders like a heavy burden finally released. "It's over," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're free." Silas held her tightly, his hand resting on her back as he whispered, "We're free, Serena, and we're going to build the life we've always wanted." And in that moment, with the world outside their door finally at peace, Serena knew that they had truly made it. They had fought for each other, for their love, for the future they wanted to build. And now, with the promise of their child growing inside her and the safety of their home around them, Serena could finally let herself believe that she was worthy of the life she had always dreamed of. As the days turned into weeks and then months, Serena and Silas continued to build their life together. Their love grew stronger with each passing day, their bond deeper. And as the first snow of winter began to fall once more, Serena held their newborn daughter in her arms, the warmth of the cabin surrounding them. Silas stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as they looked at their daughter together, the embodiment of the love they had fought for. And for the first time in her life, Serena knew that she was truly home. The cold winds of the past had finally been left behind, and the warmth of the present, of their love, filled the cabin, the promise of a bright future shining in their eyes. "What should we name her?" Silas asked softly, his voice full of tenderness. Serena smiled, looking down at their daughter, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace. "Hope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her name is Hope." And as they stood there, looking at the life they had built together, Serena knew that hope wasn't just something to hold on to. It was something to build day by day, brick by brick, together.